So previously we took a look at the fact that we don't know much about city-states in the Greek world. I mean, we know a lot about Athens because they wrote stuff down. And we looked at how some of the lawgivers, namely Draco and Solon, changed their societies. When most people think about Greece, Athenians walking around in togas might come to mind. The Spartans probably also come to mind. And when most people think about Spartans, they either think about mascots for high school and colleges, they think about the movie 300, or they might know that they were some of the baddest warriors that ever lived. Now, for centuries, Sparta is pretty much the big kid on the block among the Greek-speaking city-states. Above all, they are known for their discipline. The fox parable is one of the most famous examples of this. Now, as part of a training to become a full citizen, a Spartan, young boys were encouraged to steal. They're encouraged to steal, but they were punished if they were caught. Now, a young boy was given a fox that his friends stole, and they wanted to train it, and this young boy was told to look after it. When he was caught, the fox hid under the young boy's cloak and began to gnaw at his insides. He refused to admit guilt, and he said, "Better to die without giving in to the pain than to save a life and live ever after in disgrace." Now, all babies were inspected. I mean, this discipline begins at birth. All babies are inspected by a council of elders, and those who were viewed as, it's harsh to say it, but those viewed as non-advantageous were left by a ravine. Because all babies are considered property of the state, so if you're born with a physical deformity, the Spartans would leave you by a ravine and the elements would take care of it. Harsh as it sounds, that was the Spartan way of life. And those that were allowed to live were taught to eat their food and to not fear the dark or being left alone. Now, service to the state is what matters amongst the Spartans. At age 7, children are taken from their parents and they're made to live in the barracks with boys their age. So it's like a military company. Their education is known as the agoge. And the training with the agoge is to prepare them to obey orders and cope with stress and win battles. They didn't really live with much. So this phrase, if you live a Spartan existence, means you don't have much. It definitely comes from the fact that they had very little. They were encouraged to steal. So the reason the boy's friends stole that fox is because they were encouraged to steal, so that they would train themselves to catch the enemy off guard and become resourceful soldiers and scavengers. The men would eat together in common mess halls. They'd be given one tunic a year, and eventually, by age 30, they could become a full citizen of Sparta. Now, after their training, they would enter the military reserves at age 18, and 2 years later, at age 20, they'd be part of a full company. This notion of cowardice was forbidden. The women of Sparta would famously tell their husbands as they left for battle, "Spartan, come back with your shield or on it." In rare instances, when battle was lost, Spartans were encouraged to commit suicide rather than go home and face disgrace. Even injured soldiers are expected to have wounds on the front of their bodies instead of in the rear. Otherwise, it would promote the idea that they had fled in cowardice. You are not allowed to be a coward. It is forbidden. Now, it's not as if faith doesn't matter to other city-states in Greece, but we know that the Spartans took the word of the gods very seriously. So religion and festivals honoring these gods are sacred, and they're not allowed to be shortened or disturbed. There were times when the Spartans would actually kind of shuffle their feet when it came to acting decisively in warfare, because they're waiting for a sign. They're waiting for an omen. from the gods, or they would simply wait for the end of one of their celebrations of the gods. So they are definitely disciplined. You can see it to a degree as, many would interpret them as early socialists or even communists, in terms of the state owns everything, and faith was certainly sacred to them. Now we can see Sparta's location centrally located on what was called the Peloponnese. That's the peninsula. The name of it was the Peloponnese. Interestingly enough, Sparta itself, we see this phrase, natural protection. It's very hard to get to because it's surrounded on three sides by mountains. So because of this, there were no walls surrounding Sparta. Most cities are surrounded by walls. They don't have them, so that made them unique. When asked about this, there was one Spartan who famously pointed at the soldiers of Sparta and said, "These are our walls." Which, yeah, it worked out because the mountains were nearly impassable. The laws were only transmitted orally. They were not allowed to be written down. When the Spartans began shifting to a military society, they weren't allowed to be written. And what we know mainly comes from the Greek historian Plutarch, who wrote them down after the fact. Everything was transmitted orally and remembered. All laws were memorized, and the citizens acted as a check on each other. The concept of change is viewed negatively. It's in the very negative context. So, no commercial class, a merchant class, traders are forbidden. And because of this, there was no need for monetary exchange. The only type of currency allowed was a specific iron currency that was only good in Sparta. And since accumulating excessive wealth is frowned upon, it didn't really pay to try and steal money or hoard it. So they have geographic protection, they only speak their laws and remember them, and these guys do not like change at all. Not even a little. If we're to put a term on how they govern themselves, we would say oligarchy, rule of the few. They led with 2 kings. They had 2 kings so that they would never be leaderless when they marched into battle. One would take charge of the armed forces, the other would stay behind. There was a council of elders made up of citizens who were over 60, and they served for life. And in addition to the 2 kings and the council of elders, we have a good image here of 5 ephors. The ephors served for a year and could not be re-elected. 2 of them would always accompany the army when they went on campaign, and they had massive amounts of power. The only people who could serve as the ephors are full citizens, and at any given point there were about 8,000 to 9,000 full male citizens at any time. So it really is a rule of the few. We're not talking about the ecclesia or the general assembly we would see in Athens. When it comes to we want the people to participate, no, change is bad. They don't like that. Now you get somewhat of a decent idea of the city-states that surrounded Sparta, but there were about 30 communities that were made to provide manufacturing and infrastructure. The people who live there are known as helots, the slaves. Helots are slaves, and normally they were captured peoples who worked in the fields and were property of the state. Poor treatment is an understatement. As part of training to become a full citizen, Spartan youth would often have to sneak out to kill the biggest and the strongest. And this treatment is so bad that in the 400s, there was an instance that 2,000 helots, because these slaves were often conscripted to fight. It was reported that 2,000 helots showed extraordinary courage and bravery in battle. After a ceremony honoring them, they all disappeared. They were liquidated. And this helps explain why Sparta became that military society. They constantly are in fear of a slave revolt. It's not just to go out and fight in battle, it's for personal protection, to keep the helots in line. So this at least helps explain why Sparta developed the way they did, but also why they were so different than their contemporaries in the ancient Greek world.